Paradise stars Elijah Wood as a young boy sent to live with his mother's best friend, while, unbeknownst to him, she tries to deal with her husband leaving them. We follow the boy as he connects with his hosts and neighbors and learns some important life lessons. In my journey to watch through all Elijah Wood's movies, this is not the first one where he's been a lead, but it's the first one where I felt like he was given something to work with, and he's pretty solid here. Those big melancholy eyes serve him well when playing mournful children processing trauma. The rest of the movie is alright. It doesn't quite land in the end the way that I hoped it would, and while I appreciate that it doesn't wrap it up too neatly, it feels like something is missing. A lot of the in-between scenes are separately good, but they don't feel like they build to anything. There are plenty of good individual moments though, and none of the movie is particularly bad, just ultimately unmemorable. Born Reckless is a 1930 John Ford movie about a member of the mob who decides to go straight after getting caught, but his old friends and connections keep catching up with him. This is a slightly more interesting look at this kind of story than I expected, partly because he's still so very friendly with his old gangster pals, giving the impression that nobody has a problem with him having left, until suddenly someone does. It feels at first like a more optimistic version of the story, as if he can have it all, both his old friends and his new life. It does take a bit of an abrupt turn downward in the second half, which feels a little disorienting and disconnected, but that mostly works thematically. This is the earliest movie I've seen from Ford, and the way he structures his film, both visually and narratively, definitely is an indicator of where he landed later. Simple but powerful narratives about people trying to live their lives. I'm not going to remember the details of this film, but I hope I remember the interesting twist it put on an old trope. Superlopez is a Spanish-language parody of Superman that follows much the same plot. An alien couple send their infant son to Earth, where he is raised in a human family and eventually has to figure out how to use his powers for good. While I was mostly expecting this to be a lazy, half-hearted attempt at capitalizing on superhero popularity, I found myself actually decently surprised and chuckling quite a few times. The comedy is broad, but generally the script is clever and the line deliveries are funny and the physical comedy is on point. Our main character is intelligent enough that we can believe him to be a capable hero, but just out of his depth enough that his stumbling can be comical. We have a fun cast of supporting characters too, from our superhero's parents, to his best friend, to his secret nemesis. Overall, it's not an amazing movie, but it was certainly a lot more fun than I expected it to be. Bonheur des Dames follows a ladies' department store that is growing and putting smaller stores out of business. I think. I'll be honest, I feel awful reviewing this movie because despite one or two visually and cinematically interesting moments, I found the story so boring that I could barely pay attention to it. There were so many women who all looked and were styled exactly the same that I found it difficult to track any one character, and characters appeared and disappeared without me being able to lock in how they were connected to this story. That being said, there were a couple of really interesting cinematic choices. In one scene, an operatic aria plays over a silent scene, at one moment matching up perfectly so that the female lead lip-syncs one of the lines to the other person in the scene. In a later scene, there are some wonderfully chaotic edits conveying a character losing their grasp on reality, and it suddenly drew my attention in a way the rest of the movie hadn't. But those moments are few and far between, in a tedious narrative I just couldn't get into. Way Pendulum is an extremely silly look at an eccentric family living in Britain. There's not a narrative so much as just a series of events. One family member is teaching weight machines how to sing, another reconstructs an entire courtroom in their living room. It reminds me a little bit of You Can't Take It With You, except a whole lot goofier. While I did find myself wishing for a more cohesive narrative arc, there were definitely enough moments in this that made me laugh out loud. There's especially some fun, witty wordplay in the courtroom scenes, and they kept me entertained enough that I didn't feel the lack of narrative cohesion. I wish the first half of the movie was equally busy in its goofiness. It feels mostly like setup that doesn't get resolved, but if it had been as full of gags as the latter half, I think I'd have enjoyed the whole thing quite a bit. It's definitely something unique, and while it doesn't all hold together, there was enough fun about it that I'm certainly glad I saw it. A Fairy Tale After All is about a high school girl who discovers a fantasy land where she is actually a princess trying to save her father from an evil witch. And it's one of the worst movies I've seen in a long time. It so clearly wants to be Labyrinth, but it's incomprehensible and cheap looking, and the high school lead is clearly at least in her 30s, none of the jokes land, and the songs are bland ballad after bland ballad, with an occasional insufferable character song to break things up. On top of that, there are all these moments where I think the director is trying to get artsy with some black and white cinematography, but juxtaposed with these awful meta jokes, it just feels obliviously pretentious. The problem here is with the script, first and foremost. You can get away with low-budget filmmaking if you have a solid script, and that just isn't the case here. It thinks it's being funny and poignant and creative when it is extremely not. And the actors are so over the top and cheesy, they don't do it any further favors. Just a mess of a movie from beginning to end. Moby Dick is a loose 1930 film adaptation of the famous book by Herman Melville, featuring John Barrymore as Captain Ahab. When I say loose adaptation, I mean that it's kept basically the premise of Ahab's frenetic search for the white whale, and that's about it. In this version of the story, he was going to marry a woman from back home, only to lose his leg and his chance at love, which drives him in his quest for Moby Dick. Given the fact that I didn't enjoy the original book at all and found it to be mostly a collection of whale facts, I much preferred this narrative-driven version of the story. Barrymore's Ahab is charming in the first half of the movie and believably tortured in the second half, and it's easy to resonate with his struggle. I truly found myself wondering how you adapt Moby Dick to the screen, although I know it's been done several times, but this is one way to do it, and it works pretty well for me. Madam Satan stars Kay Johnson as a woman who learns her husband is cheating on her and she determines to win him back. This is an early Cecil B. DeMille film, and it did make me wish I had a better film version of it, as the one I was able to find was pretty grainy, and DeMille's elaborate visuals are on display here in a way I could admire even through the subpar digital transfer. Johnson is spectacularly likable in this. Even when the film leans hard into decent woman versus indecent woman slut-shaming tropes, her character still comes across as a real woman, being devastated and ashamed at the loss of her husband. The second half of the movie gets wild in a truly delightful way, jumping from the tragic melodrama of the first half to a silly mistaken identities farce to, abruptly, a disaster film. It's not at all the way I would have envisioned this kind of movie playing out, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and the lengths to which the story went. Well worth a watch. The Gray Man stars Ryan Gosling as a prisoner who was released in exchange for wiping his identity and serving the CIA as an undercover hitman. But suddenly, Gosling finds himself in the possession of something the agency wants, and he begins to doubt that he's on the good guy's side. While on its face, this is a typical crime thriller about someone being hunted down by former friends, there's a surprising amount of humor to be found in it, largely coming out of Chris Evans' villainous character. And can I just say, Evans as a villain continues to be 10 times more interesting than Evans ever was as a hero. Evans and Gosling have some fun, snarky back-and-forth scenes that set a fun, lighter tone for the movie than I'd have expected. And the action scenes are a bit more coherent than has been common these days, so I can actually follow and enjoy all the things going on. On the whole, this is definitely a film elevated to a more enjoyable level by its talented actors, and that's what I'm likely to remember about this movie going forward. Bigbug is a Jean-Pierre Jeunet film set in a near future in which the robots are starting to rise up and declare war against the humans. The androids working at one particular house decide to help save their humans, and so they trap an eclectic group together in that home and work to persuade the humans they're on their side. This is a very Jeunet film, with creative use of color and startling close-ups and a darkly quirky sense of humor. Sometimes that really works for me, other times it's a harder sell, but this one is pretty much a slam dunk. I absolutely adore the robot design, especially the villainous Yonix, and I love how seamlessly futuristic technology gets integrated into this world. The humor is definitely broad and cartoonish at times, but what else could it be with this kind of visual aesthetic? These themes of what it means to be human and how tech interacts with that have been explored before, and Bigbug doesn't break any new grounds in terms of what it has to say on those topics, but I so thoroughly enjoyed myself that I didn't mind that at all. This movie isn't for everyone, but I had a great time with it. The Mask of Zorro is a 90s reimagining of the pulp story of Zorro, the vigilante Mexican hero who fought against oppression and for the people. This iteration of the story features one aging Zorro, Anthony Hopkins, passing off the mantle to a younger potential hero, Antonio Banderas. As a kid, I watched the Disney Zorro series, but I've never seen any of the other versions of this story, so this was a lot of fun. This leaned completely into the swashbuckling adventure style I hoped it would, with big, lush set pieces and often silly choreographed fights. While Hopkins was never terribly convincing to me as Zorro, Banderas takes it and runs with it, giving one of my favorite performances I've seen from him, with a good mix of drama and humor. In fact, the humor works throughout nearly the whole film. This does tread the very awkward late 90s line with its female lead where, sure, she is a man's equal because she can sword fight, but also we will take every opportunity we have to objectify her. But overall, Zeta Jones holds her own and is a great foil for Banderas. Overall, a really fun watch. The Lost City is a rom-com adventure starring Sandra Bullock as a romance novelist and Channing Tatum as the cover model for her most popular series. When Bullock's research for her latest novel turns out to be a little too thorough and potentially uncovers a clue to a lost treasure, she is kidnapped to help complete the puzzle, and Tatum has to rescue her. This movie isn't incredible, it isn't groundbreaking, but it felt a little bit like a warm, fuzzy hug.
It reminded me why Sandra Bullock rose to fame in the first place, as she is so quietly funny in this, while still feeling like a fully grounded character. And Channing Tatum is absolutely charming as her well-intentioned but completely clueless romantic lead. There are definitely jokes that don't land here, but more do than I expected. And despite the big lavish location and plot points, the humor itself is actually relatively quiet and rooted in character traits. It's a much stronger, funnier, more interesting action comedy than recent efforts like Jungle Cruise or Red Notice, and I had a good time with it. Murder is an early Alfred Hitchcock mystery in which a juror who helped render an actress guilty in a murder trial wonders if he was wrong after all and sets out to try to prove her innocent. About a third of the way through, I wondered if we'd get a 12 Angry Men style situation where he has to go convince all the other jurors they were wrong, but instead we get a bit of a plotting mystery where the audience is always far ahead of where the characters are. The final scene in particular includes one long dreary section where the protagonist re-explains to us everything we've already found out. There are definitely some entertaining moments, and the climax centers around the same sort of dramatic set piece that makes films like Strangers on a Train and North by Northwest so memorable, but Hitchcock is clearly still learning his craft here, and learning how to pace his films. There haven't been a lot of other 1930 films I've seen so far in a similar vein though, so it might be more of a standout in that year than it is now almost a century later. H.M.S. Defiant, or Damn the Defiant as it is alternately known, stars Alec Guinness as a Royal Navy captain during the French Revolutionary Wars, and Dirk Bogarde as his first lieutenant. The two men have very different views of governing a ship, and they enter into a tense battle of wills that also happens to be bumping up against a planned mutiny from the non-officered soldiers. Guinness and Bogarde are really wonderful to watch here, exuding very different kinds of power, but seeming very evenly matched, and watching how their ethics play out in their treatment of others is the most engaging part of the movie. I do also appreciate how much time was spent focusing on the pending mutiny. It humanized the sailors Guinness and Bogarde were fighting over and showcased them and their needs in a compelling way. The ending is a satisfying one that lands exactly where I wanted it to. The only points where my interest flagged were the battle sequences, but even those held my attention a bit more than usual, as the movie did a good job of tying the fate of the battle to the fate of the characters in a way that I cared about. A solid watch. The Dawn Patrol stars Errol Flynn, David Niven, and Basil Rathbone as a group of British flying aces very near the front during World War I. Rathbone is the officer in charge, while Niven and Flynn are his ace pilots. We watch the group struggle with their relationships with each other while having to bear the weight of sending young men to die in perilous missions. I watched this for my 1930 film project, mistakenly thinking this was the 1930 version instead of the remake, and now I'm hesitant to go back and watch the original because I'm not convinced it will do as well without this stacked cast, as there isn't much to set it apart from other anti-war films of the same era. I do enjoy the sense of playfulness in the first half, which does a lot to bring out the contrasting devastation in the second half. I also enjoyed Rathbone's character, an officer miserable at having to send soldier after soldier on suicide missions while not being able to do any of the work himself, and it makes him bitter and mean. But overall, I don't think this one will stick with me, though it was an adequate watch.